Hello, it's day 27 of Reading the Power Broker. Everyone has to ignore the zit on my head that I just touched. I'm gonna wipe off the screen and then we'll get to it. And I remember it was really exciting where we left off because we were in the middle of the big court scene where basically the public was like so supportive of parks. They were crowding the courthouse, so pumped up. But then, big twist ending, the Republican people voted against parks and against Robert Moses because the Long Island robber barons had paid them off or like something. I don't know. So that's where we left off. Page 202 in the middle, like halfway, the third paragraph, or excuse me, the start of the fourth paragraph on page 202. My plant is still doing very well. Behind it is this plant that I'm trying to bring back to life. Oh, wait, this is really bad, actually. This was not there before. Well, anyway, my old roommate, who's a wonderful person, he bought this plant and then forgot about it. Both of these, I put them in the same pot. And so I was like, I noticed them and they were so wilted and so bad. And so I'm taking it upon myself to try to rehabilitate them. And this one looks a lot better, but the, what's this called? Not spider plant. This one's looking only okay. So we'll see. Stay tuned. All right. So Robert Moses lost and Al Smith lost the big court case about parks. And now their big $200,000 park plan is in limbo. Well, Smith said to Moses one afternoon when the two men and Mrs. Moskowitz were alone in the Biltmore apartment, "Can't you get someone to give you the money to make the thing stick?" "Who?" Moses said. The kind of money they were talking about was too much for his own family even to consider. Real wealth was required, and people with real wealth weren't the people who were angriest at him. No, he said, he didn't know anybody. Oh, people with real wealth were the people that were the angriest at him. No, he said, he didn't know anyone, and they couldn't take a chance on a turn down. If they asked someone who refused and then spread the story that they were desperate for funds to legalize the seizure, the Republicans would make capital of it, and so would Macy's lawyers. They could make only one phone call, and they couldn't make a mistake in deciding whom it would go to. The two men turned to Mrs. Moskowitz, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, her head bent over knitting. "August Heckscher," she said. Smith was doubtful. He knew that Heckscher, a 76-year-old multimillionaire philanthropist, was a recreation enthusiast who had already donated a playground to New York. But a playground cost a few $1,000s. What was required here was $250,000. And Heckscher was an elf of a man, so short that when he sat on a chair, his shoes dangled several inches above the floor. With a snow-white goatee, a snow-white fringe of hair around his bald pate, spectacles, and a perpetual serene little smile. It's so crazy how clear of an image that put in my head. Snake plant. Thank you. Why did I say spider plant? What was I thinking of? Spider plants are the spider plants are a type of plant as well. I've had spider plants before. Okay, anyway, we just got a very great visual description of August Heckscher, who might have the money we need. He had spectacles and a perpetual serene little smile. He would know that he would probably become involved in the lawsuit if he gave the money, and he hardly seemed the type of man who would voluntarily enter so savage a fight. But Mrs. Moskowitz, who had worked with Heckscher on various charities, thought he would, and she telephoned him. He agreed immediately. Okay, sorry to pause, but I have to show you this thing that my cat has been doing lately. So this is a new little window for her, and there's a view of birds, and she'll like sit there, and it's kind of like, to her it's probably like the jungle because she's with the plants, but she like makes bird sounds sort of. I guess you can't really see it, but if you hear her making weird sounds, at first I thought it was the sound of her having to puke, because she makes a similar sound when she throws up, but it's not. It's just the sound she makes when she sees birds. Maybe someone with cat behavior intel could tell me more about that. Even with Heckscher's contribution, the court fight did not go so well. Commenting that it would be a pretty state of affairs if a state commission could go about seizing land with gifts provided by private individuals, Macy's attorney, Charles H. Tuttle, later a Republican candidate for governor, said that if Moses used the money to reappropriate the land, he would be confessing that the first appropriation had been illegal. Wait, I don't get that. And Macy and his partners would be entitled to damages for that first appropriation. Yeah, that's the sound she makes. But there's no birds right now, so she's kind of being quiet. She's just on the lookout. And the second appropriation would be as illegal as the first because, he said, state law required that the money for a land appropriation comes from legislative segregation, not from some other source. Moses apparently feared Tuttle was right. Smith tried privately to persuade Macy to accept Heckscher's $250,000, plus another $12,000 the millionaire had donated to take care of accrued interest for the first appropriation and dropped the fight, even when Macy indignantly refused to accept the money. Moses apparently tried to avoid reappropriation. When the formal examination before trial began, the step had not yet been taken. At times, Moses seemed almost desperate to avoid being put under oath. On the day he was scheduled to be examined, he didn't show up in court. Okay, there we go. We got a little bit. He didn't show up in court. Tuttle asked Justice Sella B. Strong to cite him for contempt. But Strong accepted a commission attorney's explanation that Moses had believed that arrangements had been made for him to be examined at his office. And when Moses, ordered to appear, finally took the stand, he did not make an impressive witness. Testifying under oath, he swore that he had never been advised by anyone that the Taylor estate appropriation would be illegal unless the legislature segregated money for it. Had he not been advised precisely that several times Tuttle demanded, orally in a written memorandum by the Deputy State Attorney General Irving I. Goldsmith? No, Moses said. Tuttle thereupon produced the Goldsmith memorandum and waved it in front of Moses as he sat in the witness chair. Before the start of the actual trial, Moses, apparently forced into the act, took the step of reappropriation, and his attorneys began a new series of delaying actions in an attempt to stall the proceedings until January, when there would convene in Albany a new legislature that just conceivably might give him the appropriation he needed. Okay, that makes sense to me. I got a little lost with the Tuttle arguments. Assailing the commission's dilatory tactics, Norman S. Dyke, the latest in the relay of judges sitting on the case, said the trial would begin October 18 without fail. On October 18, he called the case, and Moses was not present. Okay, also there's a footnote that I just got to that says that Heckscher, the guy that with a bunch of money, Mr. Moneybags, he's the grandfather of the August Heckscher, who was New York City Park Commissioner during the Lindsay administration. That's kind of interesting. All right, okay. So the judge on the case is like basically being like, you cannot push until there's a new legislature, like we're doing the case. And he says, quote, and then Moses doesn't show up on October 18, and then he says, quote, I especially asked Mr. Moses to be here at the opening of this trial, and he might have had the courtesy to grant the court's request. Dyke said from the bench. It seems as if his absence, unaccounted for, shows a studied effort to affront the court. Tuttle asked that he be punished for contempt, but Dyke accepted a commission attorney's explanation, that he had advised Moses it would not be necessary for him to appear. The attorney then moved for a jury trial, and when the judge granted the motion, the start of the trial was delayed until December 6th. On December 7th, the commission attorneys filed more than 600 pages of briefs. Oh, there's the cat here. Filed more than 600 pages of briefs asking for dismissal of the case. But the judge peremptorily denied the motion. Okay, Pearl, you're blocking the words. You're blocking the pages. All right, well, due to some logistical difficulties, we're pausing the reading. I cannot read the words. Pearl, look at the camera and say hi to the people. Pearl, I'm so sorry. You can go on this side if you want. There you go. Okay, the judge ruled that the commission had not appropriated at the time the Taylor estate was seized the funds necessary. There were ominous developments on another front too. Jones Beach was owned by the townships of Hempstead, Oyster Bay, and Babylon. And while the Long Island State Park Commission could buy, condemn, or appropriate land owned by private individuals, state law provided that property owned by a township could be transferred to other ownership only by a vote of the township's residents. Moses had decided to try Babylon, where he spent his summers first. On July 18, 1924, he had appeared in the red brick Babylon Town Hall and asked the town board to hold a referendum. The 5 board members just stared at him. They had been elected, placed in their seats at the board table, by the votes of the Baymen, and they knew that one way to make sure that they would not be reelected would be to demonstrate anything less than complete vigilance over the priceless heritage of the sacred Bay Bottoms. The Babylon leader reminded them that, quote, Babylon wants this land, which has been hers for nearly a century and a half before the state came into existence, to keep as a heritage for its children. Keep it. It is a park at present, a natural park swept by breezes from the bay and ocean. Enjoy it as it is or improve it, but keep it. Never surrender 1 inch. Let the commission spend its money elsewhere, its editorials advised Moses. Before it, attempts to snatch property that the residents of the town of Babylon intend to keep for their children's children until the end of time. Within 2 months after Moses' request for a referendum, not only the Babylon Town Board, but the governing board of every village on the south shore of Suffolk County, as well as the villages' chambers of commerce, boards of trade, and civic associations, were lined up against the proposal. And Judge James B. Cooper, editor and owner of the Leader, could proclaim with satisfaction that the project at present has as much a chance of carrying as a great South Bay clam has of growing teeth. That's kind of a really good line. Like that was good. The project at present has as much a chance of carrying as a great South Bay clam has of growing teeth. When Moses turned to Oyster Bay, furious Oyster Bay citizens formed a Save Our Beaches committee that within days had a membership of thousands. In desperation, Moses turned to Hempstead, although he knew that votes in Hempstead town, as indeed in all of Nassau County, which went, okay, once again, Pearl's sitting over what I have to read. Pearl, you have to scooch a little bit this way. Is that okay? Perfect. She honestly didn't mind that much. Okay. Okay, so in Hempstead town, as indeed in all of Nassau County, which went whatever way the county's iron-fisted Republican boss, G. Wilbur Doty, wanted. And he had been unable to convince Doty to want Jones Beach development. Doty allowed the proposition to be placed on the ballot on the November 1925 election, and the vote was 12,106 to 4,200 against it. 4 years later, Robert Moses would remember how he had felt in 1925 when he heard the Hempstead referendum results. It looked like we'd lost Jones Beach, he would recall. It looked absolutely hopeless. More than with any other single project, his dreams had been tied up with Jones Beach, and so had his sense of urgency. He had been hearing, with increasing frequency, rumors that real estate developers were making deals with Dewey's machine to have the town turn over the land to them for private development. In his mind's eye, he could see those vast stretches of untouched sand covered with shabby bungalows. He knew there would never be another opportunity to create a great beach so close to New York City. You know, he would recall, if we lost Deer Range, it would have been bad, but it wouldn't have been the end of the world. But if we had lost Jones Beach, his voice trailed off, and then, remembering, he said, and I thought we had lost it. At the end of 1925, Robert Moses might well have thought he had lost his entire Long Island dream. The fact that development of Jones Beach could not be begun without approving votes from 3 townships, and that the only township that had voted had disapproved by a 3-1 margin, was only part of the story. Not only the options for beautiful Sunken Meadow and for the beach at Hampton Bays, but those for the Southern State Parkway right-of-way, for which he had drunk beer with farmers, had lapsed for lack of money to honor them. His negotiations with the North Shore Barons for right-of-way for the Northern State Parkway had dragged to a complete halt. He had secured easements from New York City for its watershed properties, but he had no money to develop these properties as parks, and there was no money in sight to enable him to do so. There was no money in sight to develop any park on Long Island. The legislature had refused to appropriate any in 1925, and there was no reason to believe that Long Island barons would be any less secure in their control of the legislature in 1926. Al Smith's loyalty and August Heckscher's money had pulled him back from the edge of the precipice along which he had been tightrope walking in the Taylor estate affair. But he was all too shortly, to stand trial in the affair, and the outcome of the trial might well result in the loss to the state of that property too. And even if Heckscher's gifts let the state keep the Taylor estate, there was no money in sight to legitimize the appropriations at Montauk Point and Lloyd Neck. The only concrete result of all the talk about parkways on Long Island had been an increase in the rate at which real estate promoters were littering the island with their rows of houses. All right, Pearl, I have to turn the page. Every week that winter brought the announcement of another large tract of farmland brought by a developer who was planning to erect model homes on it in the spring. It had been more than a year since Robert Moses had announced his revised and broadened park and parkway plan, a plan which had, after all, included parks and parkways, not only on Long Island, but throughout the rest of New York State, along the Niagara frontier, in the Genesee Valley, in the farmlands of the Taconic region, and among the peaks of the Alleghenies, Catskills, and Adirondacks. Now, more than a year later, parks and parkways were still located, but in the map of Moses' imagination. After all the talking, all the planning, all the fighting, they simply didn't exist. And at the end of 1925, there seemed little possibility that they would come into existence at any time in the foreseeable future. If one looked ahead a decade, even a generation, it seemed unlikely that any substantial part of the dream would be reality. Within 3 years, almost all of it would be reality. Dun dun dun, end of the chapter. Okay, next chapter, chapter 12. Robert Moses, and the Creature of the Machine. This is exciting. 18% done. That's a little bit depressing. There were many complex reasons for the realization of Robert Moses State Park and Parkway Plan. But the key reason was simple: the further evolution of Robert Moses. The construction of parkways, like the construction of conventional highways, was a potential source of great wealth to politicians. Parkways meant construction contracts. Politicians who had a say in which firms received those contracts could expect financial remembrances from a successful firm, if indeed they, or a relative or trusted associate known in political terminology as a bagman, did not actually own a piece of it. What? Okay, so politicians get money from the bagman. Parkways meant real estate transactions, generally either purchase or condemnation, both methods under which landowners could expect to do well financially. State public works officials, anxious to begin construction and not too concerned about price, because the money they were offering was not their own, were traditionally more generous than private buyers. If politicians were the landowners, and if they bought the land at pre-parkway prices from owners who didn't know the parkway was coming, and then sold it to the state at right-of-way prices, they could expect a large profit. That's kind of slimy. Thanks for the percentages. It took longer to get one's money through condemnation, but the rewards could be ever greater. The success of politically well-connected attorneys in winning high condemnation awards from Court of Claims judges who also had risen through the ranks of political machines was an open secret in legal circles in New York State during the 20s, as it would be in the 60s. Okay. And parkways meant development. Sleepy countrysides, long, static because of inaccessibility, suddenly became desirable locations for factories and housing developments when a parkway brought them close to a city or large town. Land in these areas became suddenly valuable. Land near the parkway's exits, automatic focal points for development, became particularly valuable. The politician who bought this land at pre-parkway prices and sold it as or after the parkway was being built could reap a great profit. And the politician who bought the land but instead of selling it developed it himself, building himself that housing and factories, could reap a fortune. Moreover, in terms of development, the impact of a parkway spread in ever-widening ripples. Stores and laundries and gas stations and insurance brokerage firms for the residents of the houses, subcontractors and material supply houses for the factories. This meant a burgeoning in land sales, insurance premiums, legal fees in all the areas in which politicians grow fat. It meant as well an intangible but intense additional attraction for politicians. In the dormant area, opportunities were limited because everything was cut and dried. Prices for land, for instance, being well known and firmly established, in an area opened by road, everything was changing almost on a day-to-day basis. Opportunities were wide open. To take advantage of the financial opportunities provided by a parkway, a politician had to have foreknowledge. If he wanted to be first in line with his recommendations for construction contract awards, he had to know that the highway was going to be built. If he wanted to buy land that was to be acquired for the highway's right-of-way, or land strategically near the highway, he had to know where the highway was going to be built. Not its general location, but its precise route, so that he could buy the exact lots that would be acquired. And he had to know before the owners knew, so that not knowing that their land might be valuable, they would sell cheap. And politicians had a weapon they could use in obtaining such advanced information. If they did not get it, they would not approve the building of the highway. Okay, that is so corrupt. The young Robert Moses, the idealist of Yale and Oxford, and the Municipal Civil Service Commission would not have even considered trading contracts or information for approval. Even the older Robert Moses of the New York State Association, a Moses more admiring of the ways of politicians, would not have done it. That Moses could, in 1922, still reserve his bitterest state bulletin sallies for the Nassau County Republican machine because of its link with political contractors. Even the Moses of 1924, doffing his principles to lighten himself for the purpose of his greatest dream, wouldn't do it. No sooner had he announced his park plan in 1924 than intimates of the governor wrote him asking for advance information on parkway location. Moses indignantly refused to give it to them. Senate Finance Committee Chairman Charles J. Hewitt offered to sell the State Parks Council a tract of land he owned in Fairhaven, that's in Connecticut, not Long Island. Despite Hewitt's importance to his dream, Moses refused to buy. I don't understand why he's trying to sell land in Connecticut. Moses apparently took the same attitude in his 1925 attempt to persuade Hempstead Township to cede him its portion of Jones Beach. Hempstead was controlled by Nassau County GOP leader G. Wilbur Doty. Quote, "Today they talk about political bosses," Leonard W. Hall, former national chairman of the Republican Party, would say in the 1960s. "They don't know what a real boss was. Doty was a real boss. When he spoke, the discussion was over. He always kept his word. He was known for that. But cross him and you were finished. There's no one like him today. We used to call him the last of the Mohicans." A square-faced man with a walrus mustache. Another very visual, wonderful description here. Okay. Doty had an almost visionary concept that rural Long Island would one day be a heavily populated suburban area and was always interested in suggestions for public works that could help open the island to development. But his vision was heavily mortgaged to practicality. He ran one of the most corrupt political machines in the state. In Nassau County, one observer said, zoning was bought and sold like potatoes, and much of the corruption revolved around public works. Doty's brother-in-law, Uncle Andy Weston, was president of Booth & Weston, the largest contracting firm in the county. And Booth & Weston, along with Hendrickson Bros. Incorporated, another firm in which Doty had close ties, were habitually given the lion's share of county contracts. I want to be brothers. I want to be a contracting company owner who is like brother-in-laws with the big boss of the GOP. I mean, I don't, but if I wanted to make money, I would. And since many GOP county committeemen happen to be on the payroll of the two construction firms, that's the coffee grinder. Since they happen to be on the payroll of the two construction firms, the firms helped Doty keep them in line. The link between Nassau politicians and contractors had come close to surfacing in 1922. In that year, a Supreme Court justice had impaneled a grand jury to investigate it, and the investigation had already turned up a loan from Booth & Weston to Assemblyman Thomas A. McWhinney before McWhinney persuaded the legislature to pass a bill establishing a grand commission to investigate the judge, a move that effectively stymied the grand jury. Moses had followed the case closely in his state bulletin, calling the bill legislative brigandry. He had nominated it for his worst bill of the session award. Man, I always forget that Moses used to run that like state bulletin newspaper. And it seems kind of fun, like the fact that he has a worst bill of the session award, that's kind of fun. But then the state bulletin is the one that he kind of ran into the ground because he was way too supportive of Al Smith. And everyone was like, wait, we're not supposed to endorse candidates, especially not the Tammany ones. Anyway. Okay, Moses had followed the case. He had castigated the Nassau GOP machine and McWhinney, whom he termed the creature of the machine. And McWhinney is the assemblyman who got money from one of the contracting firms that had close ties with the GOP boss of Nassau County. Moses must have known what it took to get things done in Nassau County, but he apparently wasn't willing to do them. The best proof of that, perhaps, the defeat of his Jones Beach referendum. In late 1925, the dream all but dead, Moses held a series of private meetings with Doty. There is, of course, no record of what transpired at those meetings and no proof that any deal was entered into. But certain developments ensued. And now we have, for the first time in the entire book, a bulleted list. First bullet point. Moses announced that future planning for Jones Beach would be conducted in conjunction with a delegation from Hempstead Township, which would, of course, have access to commission plans showing the precise location of the proposed Meadowbrook Causeway to Jones Beach. And the chairman of the Hempstead delegation turned out to be Assemblyman Thomas A. McWhinney. And Moses was soon meeting regularly with the creature of the machine on an extremely friendly basis. Okay, so the subtext is like he's letting this corrupt guy have access to information that will help him make money. And then next bullet point. Within 2 months after Moses and McWhinney began meeting, a lawyer who was a member of the Nassau County GOP's inner circle formed a corporation with a group of associates. The only business the corporation ever transacted was the purchase and sale of land, and the only land it ever purchased and sold was 265 acres of undeveloped, all but worthless meadow and swampland, 99.5 acres of which would become the right-of-way for the Meadowbrook Causeway, the remaining 165.5 of which would, when the causeway had been completed and the land's value enhanced, be sold by the corporation to private developers. When the contracts for the causeway and for other park commission projects on Long Island were awarded, a substantial number went to Uncle Andy Weston and Hendrickson Bros. Incorporated. And the last of the Mohicans abruptly left the teepee of the committee's opponents and smoked the peace pipe with Robert Moses, supporting every one of Moses's Long Island proposals. That's the end of the bulleted list. Okay, I'm gonna end there. It's the top of page 210. Okay, goodbye.